So it was no picnic, but compared to what happened under German occupation, I suppose it was much preferable. Of course, at that time, nobody yet knew how horrible life would become. In 1941, our part of Poland, well, which was basically part of the Soviet Union, became occupied by the Germans when they attacked their ally Stalin, and after that all the atrocities the Germans were perpetrating in their zone of occupation was also practiced in where we lived, and back in all those parts of Russia that were occupied by the German troops. At first the Germans, had a very, very successful war against Russia. With the German occupation came all the Hitler's laws that he practiced in the rest of Poland, occupied Poland. And at that point, unlike the Russians, who did not necessarily practice anti-Semitism, it just happened that the Jews belonged to groups that they were against, but not because they were Jewish. The Germans were a lot more specific and targeted the persecution of, at that point, of the Jews, and not necessarily of the others. Later on during the war, of course, they started persecuting left, right, and center, and of course, domestic resistance rose, and the area became very, very unsettled. I might add that at the time the war broke out in 1939, my mother, luckily for her, was not in Poland. She was vacationing in France, so she never came back, but made her way from Poland to Portugal to Canada, and lived the rest of the war in Canada. So I was with my father, who was a prominent lawyer in Poland, and also an art critic and so on. And when the Germans came very soon afterwards, Vilna, the Germans opened a Jewish ghetto in Vilna, which was basically all part of the city where Jews lived in the old days, and crammed us all into that ghetto. That was maybe within 3-4 months of their arrival. Soon afterwards, they started deporting Jews from the ghetto, and my father felt that it was best to make a run for it, because he was such a well-known person. Obviously, we couldn't hide in Vilna, our hometown, so we went to Warsaw, and a group of us got false identity papers and all pretended that we were not Jewish, because otherwise we would have had a very short lifespan if that was not the case. I still remember getting my birth certificate, forged by the way, of course. It was freshly minted. I remember rolling it in the dirt to make it look like it had some age on it. But in Warsaw, we rented an apartment, and after a while, it appeared that life for the Jews in the Warsaw ghetto was sort of stabilizing, and my father decided for us to move into the Warsaw ghetto, and which we did. Now it was a totally wrong move, because a few months afterwards, Warsaw ghetto started. The Germans started a process of liquidation. There were maybe 3 or 4 phases in which people were deported, particularly the old, the children, and those that were no particular labor value to the Germans. And then, after a few days of that deportation, before it reached our neighborhood in the ghetto, my father decided that we better leave the ghetto and go back to the Polish side where we had been hiding before. because some of our group had stayed behind, so there was a place we could go to. And what happened was just unbelievable. It was just one of those miraculous coincidences that made me be here today and not dead in a crematorium. There was a group of, to get out of the gate, we had to go through a gate. And the gate was guarded by police, German police, I think Gestapo, maybe some Polish police too. I'm not quite sure about that, because I don't remember that part of it. But there was a group of Polish workers coming out of the ghetto, going home, and I just attached myself to that group. And miraculously, a lorry, a truck came into the ghetto, and the police were so occupied they just waved us through. Nobody checked us out.
Wow.
So I was outside the ghetto. So that was my number one miracle, so to speak, that I was able to escape. My father did escape too later on, because the able Jews, men, were taken sometime outside the ghetto in the work gangs, and he was in one of them. And when he was on the Polish side, somehow or other, he saw an opportunity to detach himself, and he did. And both he and I went back to the lodgings that the rest of the Jewish group that was hiding lived in.
So were you and your father separated for a time?
Probably there was a short time we were separated, but he knew where
Oh, okay.
if I survived, he knew where I was. Now, he wouldn't know necessarily that I made it.
Okay.
There was no cell phone to
Yeah, exactly.
to check on you. In a sequence of events, after a few months, a knock on the door, and a Polish policeman arrives and says, "Well, I know you are Jewish. I came here to arrest you." Something didn't seem right, because my father, being a lawyer, he was a lot smarter than the policeman was. And anyway, at the end of the day, the policeman walked away with all of our valuables, but left us behind. We knew at that time that the time would be running out, that he or somebody else would be coming back, so we all started looking for a place to live. But before we really got it nailed down, and that on a very day I'll never forget, I did not look Jewish at all in those days. I was a blonde child, but by that time maybe I was 10, 11, something like this. So I was employed by the whole group to go out and do the shopping, and they were sort of staying hidden, because my father particularly did not look so Jewish. It was just unfortunate. And Poles were very, very sensitive to it. I mean, they could tell a Jew. I just had instinct for it. And the problem, we wouldn't have had the problems we had with the Germans if the Poles were not so cooperative, because the Germans, on the other hand, had not the slightest clue. We had to be pointed by the Poles, say, "Hey, this is a Jewish family, go and get them," type of thing. And on their own, they would not have achieved the success quotation marks, that they did. So anyway, on that day I was sent out shopping. It was a beautiful spring day, I still remember it. And after I'd done the shopping, I was walking back, and I saw some commotion in front of our apartment. We lived in a small apartment block. And a minute or so later, and I was walking on the other side of the street, thank God, saw my father and the rest of the group taken out of the apartment and put on a van. There was a horse-driven type with the police and all, and escorted away. And as I was walking in the direction of the apartment, they were coming in my direction, basically being arrested. I think they obviously did not want to seem to recognize me, nor would I want to seem to recognize them. I just went on. If I had come back a minute or two sooner, I wouldn't be here either. If I came a few minutes later, not knowing what had happened, the Polish neighbors would have, I'm sure, seized me and turned me over to the police, because the danger of sheltering a Jew was to be treated like a Jew. At that point, I was alone. My father was gone. My mother, of course, was in Canada, which I had not the slightest idea where she was. The rest of the group was arrested with my father, so as far as I was concerned, they were gone. And for the next maybe 4 or 5 months, I had to fend for myself. And here I am, maybe by that time 11 years old, maybe 11, 12-year-old, something like that. I went to see some friends of my father who were Polish, because they didn't want to have anything to do with me. It was too dangerous for them, but they gave me a little money. And I went to live with a family, or actually it was a janitor and a son, who I don't think knew that I was Jewish, but he befriended me and let me sleep there. And for a living, what I did, I took the money I had, which wasn't that much. I would go to the fresh food rack, to an outdoor market, buy produce, carry it back, and sell door to door. Unfortunately, in food, I was eating my own inventory. But in the process of it, there was one lady there who was my customer, and she asked me if I wanted to live with her. So that was a godsend, because I could not. This was now the fall, and I would never survive the winter the way I was doing. So of course I said yes, and she took me in, and it was like heaven. I mean, she was the wife of a Polish officer who was serving with the Polish army in the West.
So he wasn't home, was he?
No, he was not home, and they were able through underground to send money to Poland. So she was
wealthy.
I say by the wartime standards, she was doing well, because I mean certainly we're not lacking in food.
Wow.
That was good.
And you spent the rest of the war there?
Well, I think there was maybe like a year and a half or something left of the war in that location. But later on, another member of the group who was arrested when my father escaped, and they had an idea where I was, so he came over too and lived with us for a while. Then he was caught and killed. Perhaps 3 months or so before our liberation, my father escaped from prison, and there's a book, by the way, written about it. He and 10 others made the escape, and I'm in that book too, by the way.
What's the name of the book, do you know?
Jewish Martyrs of Pawiak. Pawiak was a big prison in Warsaw. And the writer of the book, now deceased, was one of the escapees with my father. Because my father knew how to trace me, I met this man. In fact, he stayed with us for a while, and then he moved on. But when we were liberated by the Russians, he took me and found my family, and
wow.
I was very lucky that I had uncles in London, and the name was so distinct, and I remembered it, that when London Telephone Directory was checked for the names, there were 2 of that name, and both were my uncles.
That's perfect.
So they said, yeah, sure. And I left Poland, I went to Sweden, I stayed there for a while, and eventually England, where I rejoined my mother and life.
So your mother and father both survived?
No, backing up, after my father stayed with the janitor after he escaped, that I had mentioned before. After a while, the group thought it was dangerous for them to stay there, it was too conspicuous, so they left. And my father got a room someplace else. One morning he went for a walk. He was recognized as a Jew, and he was killed on the spot. He wouldn't be obviously didn't want to be caught. And another one of the group was caught and tortured, but he never gave my address away, which was obviously a fear everybody had.
Yeah.
But that's the benefit of being a child. You don't quite fear things like the adult would. Today, much life, lesser things worry me. I don't know how I didn't worry so much then.
Less than a year later, there was a white girl and a black guy that worked at the Pizza Hut on 58 Highway, and they had been dating. And they went out to the parking lot one night after work to get in their car, and a man shotgunned them both, killed the black male and wounded the female. That too turned out to be John Paul Franklin. And we found out about all of this in the 90s, about 91 or 92, when he was in prison on death row for other crimes against minorities and Jews and things like that. And for whatever reason, I guess to buy some time, he started confessing to these various things, and we cleared the cases then. But until that happened, we had no idea why it was happening or who was doing it.
I'm always surprised at the amount of racism that still exists. When I first came to Chattanooga, I didn't think there was a lot of racism, but then, and it really bothered me when I had Elizabeth, because I struggled with having a child and bringing a child up in a racist world. And when I really started to struggle with it was when she was at UTC, and there was, I can't remember the little girl's name, but she used to call Elizabeth names, and at first I didn't realize what was going on. Well, then Elizabeth would come home with these stories, and then she started having nightmares. And the one I remember the most vividly is there was a dragon that was chasing all the kids, but the dragon would not eat her because she didn't taste good. She was burnt and she didn't taste good, but the dragon ate all the other kids. And finally, I got fed up with it, and I went to talk to the director at the center. And she told me, of course, that that was not tolerated, and that she would talk to the parents. And I thought, well, okay, it'll be resolved. Well, then she calls me back and she says, I hate to tell you this, but I talked to the parents, and the parents said, of course that's what she said, because that's what we say at home. And I have to admit, I was stunned, because I had no idea that people actually taught their kids that, and secondly, even if they did, would admit it to someone. And they admitted it and said that they had no intentions of changing, because that's the way they were and that's what they believed.
When I was in 3rd grade, I remember we were all, it was like right before recess, and we were the first grade to go out to play before the older kids went out to play. And we came outside, and the whole playground had been spray painted with like graffiti and like derogatory terms like kill the niggers and white power and just all kinds of crazy stuff. And I had never been exposed to anything like that before, so it was kind of a shock. And the teachers tried to shelter us, but of course we were curious and we had to read it and all the, like little kids do. So I remember going over to a bench, and it was me and my friends, and most of my friends were white, but a couple of them were black. And we went over, and it said white only.
First came to Providence, I was the second black attorney that they had there in the legal division. And most of the people were very nice and very welcoming and just great people. But occasionally I would run into people that didn't treat me the same way they treated everybody else. And the one thing that I remember, I was in the process of moving from one building to another, and I was actually moving to new space that hadn't been configured, and I'd asked for certain things. And the guy was real nice, very accommodating. So when he comes up there to move me, he just stares at me. I mean, just stops short, and he's just staring at me. There's a group of people standing there, and he says,